Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Glad to have you here for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, has your evening left any blank spaces still unfilled? A letter unanswered? A line unwritten? Watson learned that an empty space can speak as loudly as any signature, if one has the patience to question it. Do subscribe, so no margin goes unread. Find us too on Spotify, the link waiting below. Now, lean in. For as Holmes held, it is the unquestioned assumption where certainty writes its most dangerous name, summons to Belgrave Square. It was upon a bitter evening in February, with the fog lying thick along the Marylebone Road and the lamps burning dim and yellow through the murk, that I first heard the name of Sir Claudius Meredith. I had returned to our old lodgings in Baker Street, but a fortnight before, my wife having gone to visit her aunt in Devonshire, and I confess that I had welcomed the arrangement, for the routine of married life, however dear to me, had left me hungry for the old excitements of Holmes's company. He sat that night in his armchair by the fire, his dressing gown drawn about him, and his violin idle upon the table, for he had been in a mood of profound and voluble idleness for the better part of a week, complaining that London had grown stale, and that even its criminals lacked originality. It was nearly 9 o'clock when we heard the sharp clatter of a hansom drawing up below, and a moment later the familiar heavy tread upon the stair announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered without ceremony, his coat still beaded with the damp of the fog, his face drawn with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes his errand will not long detain him. "I shan't keep you, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself without invitation. "It is a bad business, but I fancy a simple one. Sir Claudius Meredith has been shot dead in his own library, and I dare say we shall have the man who did it in a cell by morning." Holmes did not open his eyes. "You interest me chiefly," said he, "in your use of the word simple. It has been my experience, Lestrade, that the word is generally applied to those matters which will presently prove the least so." "You may say what you like," Lestrade replied, undeterred, "but I do not think you will find much to occupy you here. Sir Claudius, as you may know, was a retired judge of the Indian courts, a man of considerable reputation, who has lived these 10 years in Belgrave Square with his wife, Lady Eleanor, and his ward, a young woman by the name of Marian Gray. Tonight, a little after 10 o'clock, he was found dead in his library, shot through the chest. The door was locked from within, and the household had to force it." "And the circumstances?" Holmes asked, opening his eyes at last. "As plain as I could wish. There is a young man, Daniel Venn, a printer with radical sympathies, whose father was hanged some 20 years since under a warrant that Sir Claudius, then a colonial judge, had signed. Venn has never ceased to declare that the hanging was unjust, and he has said as much publicly, more than once, in terms that verged upon threat. This very evening he called at the house. A servant heard voices raised in the library and Venn's own voice crying out, 'One day you shall answer for the warrant.' He was seen to leave in great agitation some 20 minutes before 10. Less than half an hour later the shot was heard. You have arrested him? Not yet, though I have men watching his shop. I wished you to see the room before it is disturbed further, though I confess I do so more from habit than necessity." Lestrade drew out his notebook. Upon the desk beside the body lies an old official form, the printed heading of which reads Warrant of Death. It bears Sir Claudius's own signature, but the space for the prisoner's name has been left blank. Beside it was a note, printed, we believe, upon Venn's own press. It reads, "Before midnight, the blank shall be filled." I own that, upon hearing this recital, I felt the case to be, as Lestrade had said, a plain one, and I glanced at Holmes to see whether he shared my conviction. His face, however, wore that expression of sharpened attention, which I had learned to associate not with certainty, but with its opposite. "The meaning seems clear enough," I ventured. Venn believed himself to be filling in, at last, the blank that Sir Claudius had left 20 years ago, only this time with the judge's own name. "It is a meaning of great symmetry," said Holmes, "which recommends it highly to a jury, and but faintly to me. Symmetry, Watson, is a literary virtue. It is not, in my observation, a common feature of actual crime, which is generally as untidy as the men who commit it. Well, Lestrade, I will come, though I promise you nothing beyond an examination of the room. You'll come round to my view, I don't doubt, said Lestrade, rising and reaching for his hat, with the comfortable air of a man already anticipating a modest triumph. We drove through the fog in near silence, the cab lamps casting a feeble and wavering light upon the wet pavements. I attempted once or twice to draw Holmes into conversation, but he sat with his chin sunk upon his chest, his eyes half closed, and answered only in monosyllables. It was not until we had nearly reached Belgrave Square that he spoke of his own accord. "You will observe, Watson," said he, "that we have been given, within the space of an hour, a locked room, a public quarrel, an overheard threat, a written confession of intent, and a motive 20 years in the ripening. It is a great deal of evidence for one evening's work, and it all points, with really quite remarkable unanimity, in a single direction. Surely that unanimity is in its favour, or against it. Consider, Watson, when a piece of evidence arrives already furnished with its own explanation, when it does not merely lie upon the table but stands up, as it were, and announces its own meaning. I have generally found it wise to ask who benefits from that particular meaning being so readily received. Evidence which explains itself has usually been arranged for an audience. We have not yet seen the room, and already I am told what it signifies. That troubles me more than any silence would." I made no answer, for I had none ready, and in a few moments more the cab drew up before a tall dark house in Belgrave Square, its windows lit and a constable standing stiffly beside the door. Somewhere within, I knew, lay the body of a man whose death seemed, by every outward token, to be as simply accounted for as any I had encountered in all my years with Holmes. I did not then suspect how far that appearance was to prove itself a deception, nor how many quiet and terrible calculations lay folded within that single blank space upon the warrant. Chapter 2. A Man Who Appears Guilty. The library of Sir Claudius Meredith was a long, sombre chamber, its walls lined to the ceiling with volumes of law and colonial record, and it was here, in a great leather chair drawn close to the fire, that we found the body. He had been a spare, upright man, with the sort of face that suggests long habituation to command, and even in death there remained about him a certain judicial severity, as though he had been interrupted in the act of delivering an opinion. A single wound marked his breast. The room was cold, for the fire had sunk to embers, and a French window at the far end stood fastened, but not, I noticed, curtained. Holmes moved about the room with that curious gliding economy of motion which I had observed in him 100 times before, touching nothing, yet missing nothing. Lestrade, meanwhile, stood by the desk with the satisfied air of a barrister who has already secured his verdict, and proceeded to lay the material evidence before us, as though presenting exhibits to a jury. "You will find it all of a piece, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Here beneath the desk a revolver, registered to Daniel Venn, one chamber discharged, as you may see for yourself. Here, upon the carpet by the window, a smear of mud, which our man tells me matches precisely the soil behind Venn's printing shop in Clerkenwell. And here," he held up a small object with something of a flourish, "a brass button of a somewhat distinctive pattern, which I am creditably informed belongs to the coat Venn was wearing this very evening. It lay beside the chair, not 2 feet from where Sir Claudius sat." I confess that as I listened, the case against the young printer seemed to close about him with the neatness of a well-fitted lock. Holmes, however, received each item with no more than a murmured word of acknowledgment, and turned instead to question the household. Lady Eleanor Meredith received us in the drawing-room, a handsome woman of middle years, dressed in unrelieved black, whose composure struck me as remarkable in a widow of but 2 hours' standing, though I set it down at the time to breeding rather than indifference. She confirmed in a low and steady voice that Daniel Venn had lately importuned her husband for access to certain papers touching his father's execution, and that Sir Claudius had refused him with some heat, threatening to have him removed by the police should he call again. He was a man of violent language, she said, though I will not say of violent character. That, I confess, I do not know. Marion Gray, Sir Claudius's ward, was a young woman of perhaps 22, dark-eyed and pale, whose hands I observed were not entirely steady as she spoke. She admitted with evident reluctance that Venn had spoken bitterly of revenge upon more than one occasion, yet she insisted with a warmth that seemed to surprise even herself that he was incapable of murder. "You know him well, Miss Gray?" Holmes inquired, with an air of the mildest curiosity. "I know something of his character," she answered, and coloured, and would say no more upon the subject, though I marked the exchange and wondered at it. It was Julian Harcourt, the private secretary, who furnished the fullest account, and he did so with a precision that I confess I found reassuring. He was a smooth, well-made man of perhaps 35, dressed with quiet correctness, whose manner combined the deference of a servant with the polish of a gentleman. "Mr. Venn arrived at 20 minutes before 10, said he. "I heard voices raised almost at once, though I could not distinguish the words. He departed in evident agitation at about 10 minutes past the hour. I left shortly afterward for my club, the Camberwell, where I remained until word reached me of this dreadful event. It was at 10:15, I'm told, that the household heard the shot." "You're certain of these times?" Holmes asked. "As certain as a man may be who consulted his watch upon each occasion, Mr. Holmes. I'm not in the habit of estimating what I can know precisely." Holmes bowed slightly at this, and I thought I detected in his eye something less than satisfaction, though what it was I could not then have said. Venn himself was brought in under guard a little before midnight, and I own that his bearing did him no service. He was a tall, thin young man, dark of hair and hollow of cheek, with the look of one who has lived too long upon indignation and too little upon bread. He admitted at once, and without apparent shame, that the revolver was his, and that he had called upon Sir Claudius that evening. Beyond this he would say nothing. Asked why he had come, he was silent. Asked why he had quitted the house by the garden rather than the front door, he was silent still. Asked to account for the button found beside the dead man's chair, he looked at it a long moment and said only that he could not. "You do him no good by this obstinacy," Lestrade told him, not unkindly. "I have nothing further to say," Venn answered, and there was in his voice, I thought, less defiance than a kind of weary despair. I remarked to Holmes afterward, as we stood a moment in the hall, that I could construe such silence in no way save as the silence of guilt. A man with an honest account of himself, I said, does not withhold it at the very moment his life hangs upon the telling. "That is the most natural of conclusions, Watson, and I do not fault you for reaching it," said Holmes. "And yet I would draw your attention to a smaller matter, which passed, I think, almost unnoticed. When the warrant was shown to Venn, the blank warrant, lying still upon the desk, he did not ask what it said. He did not ask whose name might yet be written upon it, nor what threat it was supposed to carry. He asked only one question, and he asked it twice, whether the signature upon it was genuinely Sir Claudius's own. What of it? A natural curiosity surely in a man who has spent years disputing the validity of another such warrant. "Perhaps," said Holmes slowly, drawing on his coat against the raw night air without. "But consider the nature of the question, Watson. A murderer who has himself placed that warrant upon the desk as a symbol of his revenge has no need to ask whether the signature is genuine. He knows it already. He has looked upon it, arranged it, perhaps gloated over it. That is not the question of a man admiring his own handiwork. It is the question of a man who has never seen the document before, and who is searching, with some anxiety, for evidence of a very particular kind. I do not yet know what kind, Watson, but I mean to find out before Mr. Venn is hanged for a crime whose true shape none of us, I think, has yet perceived." Chapter 3. The Warrant Without a Name. We returned to the library once the household had retired, or had been persuaded to feign retirement, for I doubted that any soul beneath that roof found sleep that night. Holmes desired above all things to be left alone with the room, and Lestrade, though grumbling a little at what he termed unnecessary thoroughness, consented to withdraw with me to the hall while Holmes conducted his examination. It was the better part of an hour before he summoned us back, and in that time I heard him moving softly about, now pausing, now crossing the floor with a swiftness that told of some object suddenly seized upon. "Come and look at this," said he, when at last we re-entered, and he held beneath the lamp the document that had occasioned so much comment. It was a stiff, yellowed sheet, bearing at its head the printed words "Warrant of Death," with a formal border of the kind I associated with the more ponderous instruments of colonial administration. Below, in the careful copper plate of some clerk long since forgotten, ran the customary language of such forms, empowering the bearer to carry out a sentence upon a person named, and here the space stood empty, a long pale gap in the text like a tooth drawn from an otherwise unbroken row. Sir Claudius's signature was appended at the foot, firm and unmistakable. "The seal is genuine," said Holmes, "the paper of the correct age and manufacture, and the signature, so far as I can determine without closer instruments, his own. There is no forgery here, Lestrade, whatever else there may be." "Then I do not see what remains to be questioned," said Lestrade. "A blank warrant, signed by a dead judge, found upon his own desk on the night of his murder, with the accusing message beside it. What further meaning do you require?" "None whatever, if meaning were a thing to be assumed rather than proved," Holmes replied. "But I have observed certain particulars in this room, Lestrade, which I confess do not sit easily with the account you have given me, and I should like your opinion of them before we go further." He drew our attention first to the wound itself. There was, he pointed out, no scorching nor blackening upon the dead man's shirt front, such as one would expect had the weapon been discharged at the close range the position of the body seemed to demand. Nor was the quantity of blood so great as I should have anticipated from a wound to the chest, a fact which, as a medical man, I was obliged to own, struck me as curious the moment it was named, though I had not remarked it before. "There is more," said Holmes, moving to a small table near the fire. "Here stands the glass in which Sir Claudius took his evening medicine. Empty, you observe, and beside it a decanter of brandy scarcely touched. The fire, moreover, has burned low, though I am told by the housekeeper that Sir Claudius was most particular in having it kept well supplied through the evening, being a man who felt the cold badly since his years in India. A fire does not sink so far in the space of 1/2 hour, Lestrade, not when it has been properly built up before 9. He turned next to the mantel, where a small clock, stopped by the shock of some earlier disturbance, or perhaps by design, stood fixed at 17 minutes past 10. The household, by your own account, heard the shot at 1/4 past. Yet this clock, which we are surely meant to take as marking that same moment, records a time 2 minutes later. A trifle, you will say. And yet trifles, Lestrade, are the very currency in which this sort of case is paid. He led us then to the French window, and here his manner grew, if anything, more exacting still. He knelt upon the carpet and traced with one long finger the small patch of mud that had been found near the sill. "You will observe the shape of this deposit," said he. "It is compact, rounded, without the smearing or scattering one would expect from a boot set down, and lifted repeatedly in the ordinary course of walking. It has, in short, the appearance of soil fallen from an object carried in the hand, or set down once and no more. And here is the greater difficulty. There is no trail. Between this window and the desk where Sir Claudius sat there lies a full 15 feet of carpet, and upon the whole of it I can find no second trace, no partial print, no thread of connection between this mud and that chair. A man who crossed this room with muddied boots to commit murder would surely have left some further sign of his passage. Last of all he produced the button, turning it over in the lamplight so that we might examine the thread still clinging to its shank. A struggle tears a button away roughly, Lestrade, leaving behind a ragged remnant of thread, torn cloth, sometimes a fragment of the garment itself. Here the thread has been cut cleanly, with a blade or a pair of scissors. It was removed, not wrenched. Lestrade received these observations with a frown that spoke less of conviction than of irritation at having his certainties disturbed. "I do not say you are wrong in your particulars, Mr. Holmes, though I might dispute one or two of them. But I fail to see how any of it clears Venn. If anything, it suggests a man cunning enough to arrange his evidence with care, to plant the mud without walking through it, to cut the button rather than tear it, to stage the very appearance of a struggle that never took place." "That is precisely the difficulty which occupies me tonight," said Holmes, and for once I heard in his voice something less than his habitual confidence. "Every fact I uncover admits of two constructions, Lestrade, the one which convicts Mr. Venn, and the one which suggests that another hand has been at pains to make it appear so. And this is the very quality that renders such evidence dangerous above all others. Where a case rests upon a single strong fact, that fact may be tested and, if false, exposed. But where it rests upon a dozen small facts, each consistent with the accepted story, no one thinks to question the story itself, for every new discovery seems only to confirm what all already believe. We are not looking, I think, at the traces of a crime carelessly committed. We are looking at the traces of a crime very carefully explained. Chapter 4. The story. Everyone knows. By the morning, the whole of Belgrave Square seemed to have settled, with a kind of collective relief, upon a single account of the tragedy, and I confess that I myself was not proof against its persuasion. Lestrade, when we met him again over a breakfast we had little appetite for, laid the completed structure of his theory before us, with the evident satisfaction of a builder surveying a finished house. "It is all very simple when you set it out in order," said he, buttering his toast with the brisk contentment of a man whose labours are nearly done. Venn came to the house that evening carrying his revolver, whether for his own protection or with darker intent I do not pretend to say. He confronted Sir Claudius over the old business of his father's execution, and demanded, I should think, some manner of confession or apology. Sir Claudius, being a proud man and unused to being addressed in such terms beneath his own roof, refused him utterly. Venn then left by the garden, not the front door, mark you, in order that his early departure might be observed and remembered, creating the appearance that the quarrel had ended peaceably enough. He then waited, concealed somewhere upon the grounds, until the household had settled, returned through the French window, and shot the old man where he sat. The blank warrant he had brought with him, or perhaps had demanded and been shown during the quarrel, and he left it upon the desk as a kind of grim signature to his revenge. It was, I own, a narrative of considerable coherence, and the evidence gathered through that morning did little to weaken it. The butler questioned again, repeated with rather more confidence than before that he had heard Venn's voice raised in the passage, crying out the words, "I will not sign it," a phrase which Lestrade received as a virtual confession, taking it to refer to some final demand that Sir Claudius had pressed upon the young man regarding his father's case. A housemaid sent to air the linen in the small hours stated that she had seen from an upper window a figure in a dark coat crossing the rear courtyard shortly before the shot was heard, moving, she said, with a furtive and hurried gait that had struck her at the time as strange. And Colonel Ashcombe, Sir Claudius's old colleague from his years in India, who had called at the house that morning white and shaken with the news, recalled with evident distaste an occasion, some months past, upon which he had heard Venn declare, in a public coffee-house, that Sir Claudius deserved to stand one day beneath the same sentence he had so freely imposed upon others. It was Marian Gray, however, whose testimony seemed to close the matter beyond further dispute. Holmes found her alone in the small morning room that overlooked the square, and questioned her with a gentleness that I had not always seen him extend to witnesses of less evident distress. For some minutes she would say nothing beyond what she had already told us, but at last, under the quiet persistence of his manner, she admitted a fact she had plainly been labouring to withhold. "He asked me," she said, her voice low and unsteady, "some days before, to search among Sir Claudius's private papers for a form a legal document unsigned. He would not tell me its purpose, only that it was of the utmost importance to him. I refused, Mr. Holmes. I would not do it. But I have believed since last night, that he meant the warrant, that he came to find it himself, when I would not. I glanced at Holmes as she spoke, and I own that I felt the last doubt within myself extinguished. Here, surely, was motive married to opportunity, and both confirmed from the mouth of a witness who had every reason to wish the young man innocent, and none to invent so damaging an admission against him. Even Holmes, I thought, must now allow that the case stood proven. It would seem, then, I said to him afterward, as we walked a little in the square to clear our heads of the closeness of the house, that Venn came expressly to obtain this document, was refused, or perhaps discovered it, and was interrupted in the taking of it, and that the quarrel which followed ended in Sir Claudius's death. I do not see, Holmes, what further construction the facts will bear. Nor, I confess, do I see it easily myself, Holmes answered. And it is that very difficulty which troubles me, Watson, rather more than any difficulty in the opposite direction. When every fact conspires to a single conclusion, I have learned to ask not whether the conclusion is possible, but whether it is necessary. And there are two small questions wholly neglected in all this eloquent reconstruction, which I cannot persuade myself to set aside. What questions? The first is this. Consider the nature of the warrant, Watson, as a legal instrument. It requires, to have any force whatever, not merely a signature, but a name, a date, the designation of the prison, and the counter-signature of a second official authority. A blank so filled by any hand but that of the properly constituted power would be no more than a scrap of paper, a curiosity perhaps, but no weapon, and certainly no threat that could be executed against a living man. Why then should Venn threaten to fill in a document with Sir Claudius's name, as though the mere writing of it could accomplish anything at all? It is a threat that promises nothing, Watson, and I have rarely known a man of Venn's evident intelligence to waste his malice upon an empty gesture. And the second question? The second is smaller, but I confess it troubles me more. From the very first hour of this inquiry, every soul in that house has spoken of the blank death warrant, as though the phrase had been common property from the beginning. Yet consider Watson, who had actually entered that library before the police arrived. Not the servants, who were kept without. Not Lady Eleanor, who admits she has not yet brought herself to look upon the document at all. Colonel Ashcombe saw it, by his own account, only from across the room, at some distance, and in poor light. Who, then, first gave it that name? And why has every witness since repeated it, as though they had read it there themselves? I could not answer him, and indeed the question, once put in those plain terms, struck me with a force I had not anticipated. Holmes said no more upon the subject as we returned to the house, but I observed that his step had quickened, and that his eyes, which had shown through the morning something of their old fatigue, had recovered altogether their accustomed brightness. Chapter 5. Words chosen too carefully. Holmes spent the whole of that afternoon in a manner I had come to recognise as peculiarly his own, not in the pursuit of new facts, but in the re-examination of old ones, turning each witness's account over as a jeweller turns a stone, less concerned with its size than with the angle at which the light fell upon it. "We have had a great many events set before us, Watson," he remarked, as we crossed once more toward the servants' hall, "but precious few of the words in which those events have been described to us. I begin to suspect that it is in the choosing of words, rather than in the doing of deeds, that our murderer has been most careful." The butler, a stooped and dignified man named Corrigan, was the first to feel the weight of this fresh scrutiny. He repeated, as he had before, that he had heard young Venn cry out the words, "I will not sign it," and seemed inclined to let the matter rest there as a fact beyond further inquiry. Holmes, however, pressed him with a series of questions so mild in tone that Corrigan did not at first perceive their direction. "You heard this, I think you said, through the library door?" "Through the door, sir, yes. It was closed." "A heavy door, is it not?" "Mahogany," I observed, "and fitted close to its frame." "It is, sir." "Then you will forgive my asking precisely what you heard, Corrigan, as distinct from what you have since come to believe you heard. Did the sense of the whole sentence reach you, or only its final words, spoken perhaps with some emphasis, as a man raises his voice at the close of an argument rather than its beginning?" The old servant hesitated, and I saw the colour rise faintly in his neck. "Now that you put it so, sir, I could not swear to more than the last words. I will not sign it, spoken loud, as through gritted teeth. The rest was too low for the door to carry." "And who first told you that these words concerned the warrant?" "Why, I could not rightly say, sir. It was generally understood so by the time I spoke to the police. I believe Mr. Harcourt remarked upon it, in the kitchen, before ever the inspector arrived." Holmes thanked him with grave courtesy and turned away, and I saw upon his face the particular stillness that in him betokened not satisfaction merely, but the confirmation of some suspicion long entertained. It was from Marian Gray, however, questioned again that afternoon with rather more delicacy than Lestrade had troubled to employ, that the true meaning of those words emerged, and with it a history I had not anticipated. She was reluctant at first, and I saw Holmes wait upon her silence with a patience I had not always known him to command, until at last, with something between shame and defiance, she spoke. "Sir Claudius had learned of an attachment between myself and Mr. Venn," she said. "We had kept it secret, for I knew he would never consent to it. Daniel has neither fortune nor family that my guardian would think fit to weigh against my own. When he discovered it, he was very angry. He summoned Daniel to the house that evening, not to speak of the warrant, Mr. Holmes, not of his father at all, but to demand that he sign a declaration, renouncing all claim to me and to whatever portion of my inheritance might otherwise have come to me through marriage. It was this that Daniel refused. I will not sign it. He meant the declaration. He has never once spoken to me of the warrant since that first bitter week after his father's death. I confess this intelligence struck me with some force, for it dissolved at a stroke the significance that Lestrade's theory had built upon those 5 words, and yet I did not at once perceive how far its consequences extended. Marian went on with growing composure to explain the matter of the garden and the missing button both. Venn had gone out by the French window, she said, not from any design of concealment, but from a simple wish to avoid encountering Lady Eleanor, who had made her opposition to the match a matter of open and frequent complaint, and whose presence in the front hall that evening he had particularly wished to escape. The button, she added, almost as an afterthought, had been missing from his coat for several days before the murder, having caught and torn loose, as she understood it, upon some obstruction at his own printing shop. Dr. Pritchard, the family physician, whom we found soon afterward attending upon Lady Eleanor's nerves, confirmed a further point of some medical interest. Sir Claudius, he told us, had suffered for some years from a weakness of the heart, though he had borne it with such fortitude, and concealed it so successfully from all but his most intimate acquaintance, that even Pritchard had been surprised, upon examining him that very afternoon, to find him in his usual health and spirits. Each evening, without fail, he took a measured dose of medicine, prepared according to Pritchard's own prescription by Harcourt from a locked cabinet in the library, and this he had swallowed, as was his habit, a little after 9 o'clock. Colonel Ashcombe, when at last we came to him, supplied nothing new, yet supplied it with such conviction that I found myself, despite all Holmes had said, half persuaded once more of Venn's guilt. He recounted again the young man's bitter words of years past, that Sir Claudius deserved to stand beneath the sentence he had so freely passed upon others, and spoke of the execution of Venn's father with the discomfort of a man who had himself played some part, however small, in the events of that distant colonial emergency, and wished heartily that the whole matter might be permitted to rest undisturbed. "There, Watson," said Holmes, when at last we had withdrawn to consider the day's harvest. "You have a motive of the most satisfying kind. Public, long nurtured, twice confirmed from independent mouths, and now sharpened afresh by the discovery of a secret engagement threatened with ruin. It wants nothing. It explains everything. And it is, for that very reason, the motive I trust least of all in this inquiry. You cannot doubt that he had cause enough for anger. I do not doubt it for a moment. A motive, Watson, may explain very well why a man could commit a crime. It offers no proof whatever that he did. We have spent this day discovering that nearly every fact which seemed to condemn Mr. Venn rests upon words too hastily interpreted, a phrase overheard in fragments, a meaning supplied before the sentence was even understood. I begin to wonder whether the true criminal in this affair has committed his crime as much with a vocabulary as with a revolver. Chapter 6. The Clocks of Belgrave Square. It was upon the following morning, a grey and blustering day with rain threatening from the west, that Holmes turned the whole force of his attention upon a matter which had, until then, received scarcely a passing notice from any of us: the precise timing of the events of that fatal evening. Lestrade had assembled his case, as I have said, upon a foundation he considered unshakable: that Venn had departed the house at 10 minutes past 10, that Harcourt had followed him out shortly afterward, and that the fatal shot had been heard at 1:15, leaving the young man ample opportunity to circle the grounds and return by the garden. Holmes proposed, without any great show of ceremony, to test each stone of that foundation in turn. "You are very confident of your times, Harcourt," said he, when we found the secretary at his customary place in the small study adjoining the library, engaged in the melancholy business of setting Sir Claudius's correspondence in order. "You told Lestrade, I believe, that Venn left at 10 minutes past 10, and that you yourself departed for your club immediately thereafter." "I did, and I am confident of it still," Harcourt replied, with the faint air of a man mildly wearied by repetition. I glanced at the hall clock upon hearing the front door close behind Mr. Venn, and again as I took up my own hat and stick a very few minutes later. "You consulted the hall clock directly, then, upon each occasion?" "I did not need to consult it directly, Mr. Holmes. I had the time of it well enough in my head from the general course of the evening. But yes, I believe I glanced at it as I passed. It was a small inconsistency, scarcely worth remarking, and I confess I should have let it pass unnoticed, had not Holmes seized upon it with the swiftness of a man who has been waiting for precisely such an opening. He led us at once to the hall, and there, comparing the clock upon the wall against his own watch, which he had earlier set by the chronometer at the Belgravia post office, he demonstrated to Lestrade's evident discomfort that the instrument stood no less than 11 minutes fast. "The servants know it well, I have no doubt," said Holmes, "and correct for it without thinking, as one does with a clock long known to run ahead of the true hour. But Mr. Harcourt, who tells us in one breath that he did not trouble to consult it directly, gives us in the next breath times so exact that they can only have been read from its face and accepted without correction. It is a small matter, Watson, but a suggestive one. A man who does not know his witness is inaccurate cannot correct for an error he does not perceive." We found further and more startling confirmation in the stables, where old Trent, the coachman, sat mending a length of harness by the light of a lantern. He remembered, he said, seeing young Mr. Venn come hurrying out through the garden that evening, agitated and pale, and he remembered the hour precisely, for he had glanced up at the stable clock, a plain, reliable instrument, kept scrupulously to the true time by his own hand each Sunday, and had seen it stand at 7 minutes to 10. 7 minutes to 10, Holmes repeated, and I saw him glance at me with something of suppressed triumph in his eye. "That places Mr. Venn beyond the garden wall a full 20 minutes and more before ever the shot was heard, Watson. Not the bare minutes that Harcourt's account allows him, but time enough to have walked the better part of a mile." Lestrade, to his credit, did not attempt to dismiss the discrepancy. though I could see the frown gathering upon his brow as the tidy structure of his case began, for the first time, to show its cracks. A clock may be wrong, Mr. Holmes, whichever one you choose to believe. It may indeed, but I have this morning tested a further matter, which I think will interest you more. Holmes proposed, and Lestrade rather grudgingly consented to, a small experiment. A constable was stationed in the street before the house, another in the servants' corridor within, and Holmes himself, with my assistance, discharged an unloaded but capped revolver within the library, the door closed as it had been on the night of the murder. The report, plainly audible in the corridor, could scarcely be heard at all by the man in the street, who was obliged to admit, upon being questioned, that he had caught only the faintest suggestion of a sound, such as he might easily have mistaken for a door closing at a distance. This trial bore directly upon the testimony of the housemaid, who claimed to have seen, from her window, a dark figure crossing the courtyard shortly before the shot. Pressed again by Holmes, and with rather more candour than she had shown Lestrade, she confessed at last that she had, in truth, heard the report first, and had looked out only afterward, in some alarm, catching no more than a fleeting shadow among the shrubbery, which her own fright and the whispered certainties already circulating below stairs had transformed by the time she gave her statement into the distinct figure of a man in a dark coat. "You see how readily the mind furnishes what it expects to find, Watson," Holmes murmured to me as we left her. "She did not see Venn. She saw a shadow and was told, before ever she spoke to the police, whose shadow it must have been." It remained for Dr. Pritchard to supply the discovery which, of all that day's labours, unsettled me most profoundly. He had been engaged, at Holmes's private request, in a more searching examination of the body than the earlier and more cursory inspection had allowed, and he came to us that evening with a face grave beyond even the gravity the occasion demanded. "I do not think the bullet killed him, Mr. Holmes," said he. "The heart, so far as I can determine, had very nearly ceased its action before ever the wound was inflicted, had ceased or was ceasing from some other cause entirely. The absence of any great flow of blood which puzzled you in the library is explained at once if the man was dead, or all but dead, when he was shot. I can offer no certainty until I have made a fuller examination, but I would stake my professional reputation that poison, and not a bullet, was the true instrument of Sir Claudius Meredith's death." For a long moment none of us spoke. I thought of the empty medicine glass standing beside the untouched brandy, and felt the whole shape of the case shift beneath me like a floor giving way. "Then the shot," I said slowly, "was no more than an announcement, Watson," Holmes finished for me, and I had rarely heard his voice so quiet, nor so certain. "A signal fired into a room already tenanted only by the dead, timed with care to tell this household precisely when it was meant to believe that murder had been done. The true hour of Sir Claudius's death lies earlier than any of us have yet supposed, and I begin to see very dimly as yet the shape of the hand that arranged both the poison and the pistol alike." Chapter 7. The Coat in the Mews. We had scarcely begun to digest the full weight of Pritchard's discovery when a fresh development arrived to complicate, or so it seemed at first, the very theory that Holmes had laboured through 2 days to dismantle. Lestrade came upon us in the library a little before noon, his face flushed with the particular energy of a man who believes his case, so lately imperilled, has been restored to him entire. "You had better come to the Mews, Mr. Holmes," said he. "One of my constables has found Venn's missing coat, concealed beneath a heap of straw in the empty stall behind the house, and I promise you it does not want for company." We followed him out through the yard to the small stable building, where the coat, a dark and somewhat shabby garment that I recognised at once from Venn's own description, lay spread upon a bench for our inspection. In one pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief, was Sir Claudius's signet ring, a heavy band of gold bearing the crest of his old Indian appointment, which Lady Eleanor, summoned to identify it, confirmed with a low cry as having been upon her husband's hand when last she saw him living. In the other pocket was a single sheet of proof, printed in a clear if somewhat uneven type bearing the words, "The judge shall sign his own sentence." A torn corner of stiff official-looking paper, found tucked within the coat's lining, appeared, when set beside the warrant itself, to match the shape of a small piece missing from its upper edge. Beneath the coat, folded almost as an afterthought, lay a length of oiled cloth, such as is used in the cleaning of firearms. "There is your motive turned to certainty, and your instrument besides," said Lestrade, with the satisfaction of a man who feels his patience through 2 days of unwelcome doubt has been vindicated at a stroke. Venn poisoned the old man during their quarrel, slipped something into the medicine while Harcourt's back was turned, perhaps, or before ever Harcourt prepared it, then returned, once the poison had done its work, to fire the shot and leave his message. He concealed the coat here in his haste, meaning no doubt to recover it later. I own that even Marion Gray, when the discovery was reported to her, received it with a stricken and wavering countenance that told plainly how far her confidence in Venn had been shaken. "The coat vanished from his shop 2 days before," she said, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "and he could not tell me who had taken it, nor why. I did not know what to believe then. I hardly know what to believe now." Holmes, however, examined the new evidence with a composure that seemed, to my eye, actually to sharpen rather than diminish as the case against Venn appeared to strengthen. He gave the proof sheet a long and silent study beneath a pocket lens, comparing it letter by letter against a specimen of Venn's ordinary work which Lestrade had thoughtfully procured from the printing shop that morning. "The type is close," said he at length, "close enough to deceive a casual eye, and I do not doubt it was meant to deceive Lestrade's. But observe this capital R. Watson in the word warrant upon the earlier note, and compare it with the R in judge upon this later sheet. There is a small fracture in the serif, here, scarcely visible without the lens, which appears upon both, and which does not appear, so far as I can discover, upon a single specimen from Venn's own press, as it stands today." Venn, questioned upon the point, seemed genuinely bewildered rather than alarmed. "That type is old," said he. "I sold a case of worn founts some months back to clear space for new stock. I could not tell you now who bought it. Some dealer's agent, I believe, who gave no particular name. It required no more than an afternoon's patient inquiry among the type founders and dealers of Clerkenwell for Holmes to run the transaction to its source. The dealer, a Mr. Ezra Kimball, recalled the sale readily enough upon being shown a note of the date, and described his customer as a well-spoken gentleman of quiet and correct address, who had given no name but had mentioned in the course of the transaction that he required the type for the private printing of invitations. "A gentleman, you say, and not a workman?" Holmes pressed him. "Decidedly a gentleman, sir. I remember thinking it curious that such a person should trouble himself with worn type at all, when he might have ordered new at any respectable house in town. The description so far as it went sat uneasily well upon the figure of Julian Harcourt, though Holmes was careful, even to me, to advance no name until his proof stood surer. The torn corner discovered within the coat's lining furnished, when examined, a confirmation of a different but no less telling kind, for the fibres of that scrap, laid beneath Holmes's lens, beside a genuine sample taken from the margin of the warrant itself, proved on the closest comparison not to match at all. The true warrant, being some 25 years old, showed the particular yellowing and brittleness of age throughout its substance. The scrap from the coat, though artfully toned to a similar colour upon its surface, was crisp and whole beneath. The product, Holmes judged, of some modern paper cleverly treated to counterfeit the appearance of the old. "It is a forgery within a forgery, Watson," said he, as we walked back from the mews in the fading light. "The coat, the ring, the message, the torn scrap, every one of them has been placed precisely where it would answer the very doubts I had begun to raise not 2 days since. Consider how neatly it accounts for the missing garment, for the question of motive, for the physical instrument of poison that Pritchard's discovery now demands. It is, in short, too perfect an answer to questions that only one person in this house has heard me actually ask. You mean that whoever placed this evidence has been listening to your inquiries? I mean precisely that. A man commits his first crime with the confidence of one who does not expect to be doubted. He commits his second, Watson, with the anxious ingenuity of one who knows all too well that he is being watched. And it is in that anxiety, I think, that we shall at last find him out. He has improved his story a great deal too much for it to be entirely true. Chapter 8. The Single Unconvinced Man. That evening, over a dinner which neither of us did much justice to, Holmes unfolded to me the design by which he meant to bring the whole affair to its resolution. "We have proof enough, Watson, to trouble any reasonable jury with doubt," said he. "But doubt is not conviction, and I do not intend that this case should end in a verdict of not proven, with the true murderer left free to arrange his affairs at leisure. We must give him a reason to act, and men who have killed twice do not often bear a third temptation with patience." Accordingly, the following morning, Holmes let it be known throughout the household, casually, as though the discovery were of no great moment, and yet in the hearing of every servant who might be relied upon to carry the news below stairs, that he had detected, upon careful examination of the blank warrant beneath a raking light, certain faint impressions pressed into its surface by the pen of some earlier document once laid upon it, invisible to the ordinary eye but recoverable, he said, by patient study. These impressions, he declared, would in due course reveal the name of the prisoner for whom the warrant had originally, and quite legitimately, been intended, a discovery which he professed himself confident would settle the last uncertainties of the case. It was, of course, entirely an invention, offered as bait rather than as fact, and I own I felt some unease at the deception even as I recognised its necessity. That night, a little before 11, Holmes, Lestrade, and I concealed ourselves within the library, the curtains drawn close, a single candle shielded so as to throw no betraying gleam beneath the door, and settled ourselves to wait. The house grew silent by degrees, the last footsteps overhead ceasing, the last door closing, until nothing remained but the small sounds of the fire settling in its grate, and the slow, heavy ticking of a clock that had been set again to its proper hour. I confess the waiting told upon my nerves more than many an hour of open danger has done in the past, for there is a particular tension in sitting motionless in the dark, awaiting the arrival of a man one has resolved to unmask as a murderer. It was a few minutes past midnight when we heard it, the faint scrape of a key turning with elaborate care in the library door, and a figure entered, moving with the soft and certain tread of one who knows every board and its creak. He crossed directly, without hesitation, to the locked cabinet in the corner where the medicine and certain of Sir Claudius's private papers were kept, and had scarcely fitted a second key to its lock when Holmes's voice cut the darkness. "I think, Mr. Harcourt, that you had better explain to us what you hope to find." The secretary started as though struck, and for one instant before the candle was uncovered and his face came into the light, I believe he considered flight. But he mastered himself with a swiftness that spoke to a coolness of nerve I had not fully credited him with before, and turned to face us with something very near his ordinary composure. "I might ask the same of you gentlemen concealed here in the dark," said he. "I came, Mr. Holmes, because I could not rest for thinking of the impressions you spoke of upon that warrant. I feared, forgive me, it seemed foolish even as I thought it, that some further indiscretion of Sir Claudius's might be about to come to light, some matter that would only distress Lady Eleanor further, and I hoped to satisfy myself before the morning." "That is very touching," said Holmes, "and it would carry rather more weight, Mr. Harcourt, had I not invented the impressions entirely, for the sole purpose of drawing you to this room tonight. There was nothing pressed into that paper's surface but the ordinary handling of 25 years, only a man who believed the warrant to conceal some dangerous truth, because he himself had reason to fear such a truth existing, would have troubled himself to risk discovery in recovering it. Harcourt's face, I saw even in the uncertain light, had gone very still, though he attempted still to hold his ground. A natural anxiety, surely, for a man devoted these many years to his employer's good name. "Let us examine that devotion a little more closely, then," said Holmes, and I heard in his voice now the deliberate, unhurried cadence he reserved for the final unfolding of a case, when each fact is laid down not in haste, but with the calm precision of a man building a wall stone by stone. "You told Lestrade, upon the very first morning of this inquiry, that the warrant found upon the desk was blank, and you told him so, I have since confirmed, before ever the blotter that had been laid across it was removed, and before any man present had actually looked upon its face. You knew the position of Sir Claudius's signet ring before the body had been searched, a detail you let fall in conversation with the housemaid, who repeated it to me only yesterday, quite innocently, as a thing she had always understood you to know from the first, and you declared, upon the night of the murder itself, that the library clock had stopped at the very moment the shot was fired, though no soul in this house, myself included until 2 days past, had established that the stopping of that clock bore any relation whatever to the discharge of the pistol. Coincidence, or the natural inference of a man closely acquainted with this room and its contents," said Harcourt, though his voice had lost something of its earlier smoothness. "There is a coincidence I find rather more difficult to overlook," Holmes continued, unmoved. "You prepared Sir Claudius's medicine each evening from that very cabinet, Mr. Harcourt, and you alone held the key to it. I have this day learned from Sir Claudius's own hand a note discovered among his private papers, written but yesterday to his solicitor, that he had taken the precaution, some weeks since, of sealing that cabinet's door each afternoon with a drop of wax pressed beneath its hinge, a precaution he confided to no one but the solicitor himself, suspecting, it would seem, some interference he could not yet prove. That seal, examined by Lestrade's own officer this very afternoon upon my instruction, was found unbroken until 9 o'clock upon the night of the murder, the hour, by your own repeated account, at which you yourself opened it to prepare the medicine." Harcourt said nothing for a long moment. Lestrade, I observed, had moved quietly to stand between the secretary and the door. "Mr. Venn never approached that table," Holmes finished. "He had no occasion to, and no key had he possessed one. You alone had both the opportunity to poison that medicine and the particular knowledge required afterward to construct, detail by careful detail, the false timetable that so very nearly sent an innocent man to the gallows in your place." "I deny the murder," Harcourt said at last, his voice low and controlled even now. "Whatever else you may prove against me, Mr. Holmes, I did not kill Sir Claudius Meredith. If the medicine was tampered with, it was Venn's doing during the quarrel, while my back was turned." "That defence, Mr. Harcourt," said Holmes quietly, "is the one thread of your story that I have not yet unpicked. I promise you I shall have it unravelled before this candle burns much lower." Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Warrant. Harcourt was held that night under Lestrade's watch in a small room adjoining the servants' quarters, and it was not until the following afternoon, when the household had been gathered once more in the drawing-room at Holmes's request, that the final threads of the affair were drawn together. Lady Eleanor sat pale and upright by the cold hearth, Marian close beside her with Venn, released now from all suspicion, standing protectively at her shoulder. Colonel Ashcombe occupied a chair a little apart, his face grey with an apprehension that seemed to me, even before Holmes had spoken a word, to belong to a man who feared for more than another's guilt. "I promised you the whole truth of this matter," Holmes began, "and I mean to give it to you, though I warn you it reaches back a good deal further than the events of 2 nights past, and touches upon a chapter of this family's history that I think few of you have cared to examine too closely." He turned first to the Colonel, and though his voice remained even, I saw Ashcombe flinch beneath its quiet weight. 20 years ago, during the emergency in the Indian provinces where you and Sir Claudius served together, it was the practice, however irregular, for certain warrants of execution to be signed in advance of the naming of the prisoner, a measure defended, I understand, as a necessity of administration, In times when the ordinary processes of law moved too slowly for the temper of the authorities, Sir Claudius signed several such warrants in blank. Is that not so, Colonel? Ashcombe's hands, I observed, had tightened upon the arms of his chair. It is so, he said heavily. A shameful practice, Mr. Holmes, and one I have long wished forgotten. Sir Claudius came bitterly to regret it in later years. He had cause to regret it more than even he yet knew, Holmes continued. For one of those warrants, left in the keeping of the court's junior clerk, a young man newly arrived in the service, eager, capable, and entirely without scruple, was put to a private use of which Sir Claudius himself remained ignorant for very nearly 20 years. That clerk inserted upon the blank space a name that had never been placed there by any lawful authority, the name of a man who had in fact already received his reprieve, and whose continued life posed a considerable danger to the clerk who had, in the confusion of that troubled season, embezzled a quantity of confiscated property entrusted to his charge. That man was Daniel Venn's father. A low sound broke from Venn himself at this, though he said nothing, his hand tightening upon Marian's shoulder. The clerk who committed that forgery, Holmes went on, is now known to this household by a very different name, and occupies, or did until last night, a position of considerable trust within it. Julian Harcourt served under another name in that same colonial administration, and it was he who filled the blank upon that warrant, and he whose silence a dead man's continued existence had threatened to break. But Sir Claudius signed the true warrant that hanged him, I said, unable to keep myself from the question. How then does the guilt fall upon Harcourt rather than upon the judge himself? Because the signature was Sir Claudius's, but the naming was not, Holmes replied. Sir Claudius believed when he signed that blank form that it would in time be filled with the name of some prisoner properly convicted before a lawful tribunal. He never knew until very recently that the name inserted upon it had been chosen not by any court, but by a frightened clerk seeking to silence a man who could have ruined him. It was this discovery, gentlemen, made only within the last several weeks, that set the final tragedy of this house in motion. The surviving blank warrant, found upon Sir Claudius's own desk, was not, as we were all encouraged to believe, a threat brought into that room by an avenging son. It was evidence gathered by Sir Claudius himself of the very crime that had cost that son his father, the last proof required to demonstrate before the proper authorities how easily a signed but unnamed form might be turned to private murder. He meant to surrender it, Marian said softly. He told me only the week before that there was a matter of old business he intended to set right, whatever the cost to his own name. I did not understand him then. He intended, I believe, to place the document in the hands of the authorities the very morning after his death, Holmes said. Harcourt, once he perceived that his old crime stood on the point of discovery, resolved that Sir Claudius should not live to see that morning. He introduced a powerful poison into the evening medicine he himself prepared a little after 9 o'clock and withdrew to await its effect, expecting Sir Claudius to be found dead and alone, the cause obscure enough, perhaps, to pass as a failure of the heart he was known to suffer from. But Mr. Venn arrived unexpectedly that same evening, to press his own suit regarding Miss Grey, and to endure Sir Claudius's angry demand that he renounce her, and their quarrel, overheard in fragments by the household, furnished Harcourt with a suspect he could scarcely have hoped to invent for himself. And the shot, said Lestrade, who had followed the whole account with an expression divided between chagrin and grudging admiration, was fired afterward, once Venn had gone. Once Venn had gone, and once the poison had done its work, and once Harcourt judged the hour ripe to establish, by means of a stopped clock and a borrowed revolver, a false moment of death that would place the crime safely within the compass of Venn's departure. He scattered mud from a boot he had taken care to soil and carry rather than wear, set the coat button, cut, not torn, from a garment he had contrived to obtain, beside the chair, and arranged the warrant with its accompanying threat, a threat printed upon Venn's own idle press before ever the quarrel that evening gave him his opportunity. And when your inquiries began to trouble that first arrangement, I said, He answered you with a second. He did, Watson, and it was that second answer which betrayed him beyond hope of recovery, for it required knowledge that only the murderer could possess, the missing coat's true history, the particular objections I had begun to raise, even the very words I had used in raising them. A man defending himself with the truth need never labour so hard to anticipate his accuser. Only a guilty man rehearses his answers before the questions are asked. Confronted that evening with the recovered type, the unbroken seal upon the medicine cabinet, the false timetable exposed by clock and coachman, and finally with his own damning foreknowledge of details no innocent man could have possessed, Harcourt's composure, which had carried him through so much, deserted him at last. He confessed the whole, quietly and without further protest, in the presence of Lestrade and a constable summoned to record it, and was removed that same night to await the formal charge that would, in due course, close the account of a crime begun a generation before it ever reached its final, terrible hour. Chapter 10. The Danger of Certainty. Harcourt was taken into custody that same night, and within the week the old case of Ven's father was formally reopened, the injustice of that distant colonial hanging laid bare before the proper authorities through the testimony of Colonel Ashcombe, who gave his evidence, I understood, with the relief of a man setting down a burden he had carried a great deal longer than any of us had suspected. The dead man's name was publicly cleared, so far as such things may ever truly be cleared once the gallows has done its work, and I confess I found a melancholy satisfaction in the thought that Sir Claudius, whatever his part in the original wrong, had died in the act of seeking to right it. Lady Eleanor received the unfolding of the scandal with a dignity that did her credit, though I saw plainly what it cost her. She had come to Holmes on the second morning of the inquiry, I later learned, half hoping that the whole matter might yet be smoothed over and the family name spared the indignity of public exposure, but whatever hope she had entertained of that kind was abandoned once the full extent of Harcourt's crime and of the injustice that lay beneath it was made known to her. I had thought, she said to Holmes, upon the evening before we quitted Belgrave Square for the last time, that my chief duty was to protect what remained of my husband's good name. I see now that he had already judged that duty differently, and had resolved before his death to set the truth above his own reputation. I should be a poor guardian of his memory if I now attempted to undo what he had already begun. It was, I thought, a handsome acknowledgment, and it opened the way within a fortnight to a reconciliation that none of us had ventured to hope for at the outset of the affair. Daniel Venn was released without a stain remaining upon his character, though he confessed to Holmes, in a quiet interview I was permitted to witness, that his own silence through those first terrible days had very nearly cost him his life. I could not speak of the declaration Sir Claudius demanded of me, he said. Without exposing Marian's secret and depriving her, I feared, of every penny that might otherwise have come to her. I thought my silence a kind of protection. I very nearly discovered it to be a kind of suicide. Lady Eleanor, humbled I think as much by the manner of her husband's death as by its scandalous unravelling, withdrew at last her opposition to the match, and I am glad to record that Marian Gray and Daniel Venn were married within the year, in a ceremony of a quietness I found entirely fitting to the sombre road that had led them to it. It was Lestrade, characteristically, who offered the final word upon the case as it stood at Scotland Yard, when he called upon us at Baker Street some days after our return, ostensibly to settle certain formalities of the prosecution, but I think in truth to satisfy himself in private upon a point that had plainly troubled him. "I'll not pretend I enjoyed being proved wrong, Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself by our fire with the air of a man determined to be fair though it cost him something. "But I'll say this for the case against Venn. It was evidence enough to have convinced any reasonable man in England, myself included, and I do not think a jury would have hesitated over it for an hour." "That is precisely what troubles me about it, Lestrade," Holmes replied, "and I would ask you to consider the matter a little further before you set it down merely to Harcourt's cleverness. Reasonableness, my dear Inspector, is not measured by the number of facts that support a conclusion. 100 facts, each perfectly true in itself, are worth nothing at all if every one of them has been interpreted through a single assumption that no one has troubled to examine. You did not lack for evidence in this case. You lacked only the habit of asking who had supplied its meaning. Lestrade received this with the particular scowl he reserved for observations he could not immediately answer, though I fancied, as he took his leave that evening, that something of the lesson had lodged with him nonetheless. For my own part, I sat long that night by our fire after Lestrade had gone, turning the whole affair over in my mind and reflecting, not without some discomfort, upon how very nearly I myself had been carried along by that same current of accepted certainty. I had believed Venn guilty upon the strength of his silence alone, and had thought that silence conclusive, when in truth it had concealed nothing more sinister than a young man's tenderness for the woman he loved. I had heard the servants repeat their phrase, the blank death warrant, without once asking myself who had first given the evidence that name, or why so many mouths had come within a single hour to speak of it in the same terms. Every fact, as Holmes had said at the very outset, had arrived already furnished with its explanation, and I, no less than the household of Belgrave Square, had accepted the explanation as readily as the fact. "You're very quiet tonight, Watson," Holmes observed, glancing up at last from the pipe he had been filling with more than his usual deliberation. "I was thinking," I said, "how very easily I mistook consistency for truth. Every clue in that library seemed to accuse Venn, and yet I begin to see that they accused him only because we had all agreed, almost before we knew it, upon what those clues were meant to mean." "You have put the matter better than I could have done myself," said Holmes, and there was in his voice, I thought, something gentler than his habitual dryness, as though he recognised in my confession an echo of some earlier lesson of his own. He was silent a moment, watching the fire before he spoke again, and I have set his words down here as nearly as memory allows me, for they seem to me, then and since, to reach beyond the particular circumstances of Sir Claudius Meredith's death to something very much larger. "The most dangerous blank, Watson," said he, "is not the empty space upon a paper, however solemn its printed heading. It is the unquestioned space in a man's own reasoning, the gap he has never troubled to examine, into which certainty will write whatever name it pleases, and ask no leave of the truth before doing so." I made no answer, for none seemed needed, and we sat on a while longer in that companionable silence which had grown, over the years of our friendship, to be worth more to me than a great deal of speech, while the fire settled lower in the grate and the fog, I did not doubt, still lay thick and yellow along the streets without, wrapping the whole vast and unsuspecting city in its familiar deceiving blanket.